I'm here to speak today about the longitudinal relationship between arts engagement and health. As some of you may know, in July 2012, the Arts and Humanities Research Council announced the inception of the Cultural Value Project. We've heard already a little bit about it this morning. What this did was to signal a move away from econometric calculations of cultural value, which have dominated policy in recent years, and towards an exploration of the individual and social value of culture. When they put out a call for research, they solicited work that looked into the relationship between cultural participation and health, which was based on the understanding that various short-term cross-sectional studies had already demonstrated the short-term impact of culture upon health, but only a handful of longitudinal studies had been carried out to date. So within a base, Arts for Health, which sits within Manchester Metropolitan University, I secured funding from the Cultural Value Project, and in February 2014 set out to find the Holy Grail, which was to set up an evidence base around the long-term relationship between arts engagement and health. Like it or loathe it, our technocratic society is obsessed with evidence at the moment, so I'm hoping that this kind of evidence will actually act as a tool that we can all use in our future work. The following month, after I'd started my work, Arts Council England published this report, an evidence review, which also attempted to account for the value of culture, but it found no evidence of long-term health benefits at scale. You can see there's a quotation there, refuting any evidence of long-term health benefits. So in an attempt to fill this gap in the knowledge, I embarked on an extensive literature review and consulted several leading experts in the field, traveling to Norway, Sweden, and Finland to meet them. This yielded an evidence base made up of 15 studies, which was published online. And where the budget could afford it, we secured the reproduction rights to the original articles that had commented on these previous studies and included links to them in the evidence base so that they could be consulted in detail. This is still online, so if anybody's interested, you can go onto the evidence base and actually read the original research articles. And beyond this, I made an attempt to summarize each of the methods and findings of the studies, which also are on the evidence base, so you can just read a short summary of the interesting findings of each of the studies. And we also published these in a report, which is also available online. The report culminates in a table, which gives an overview of the different studies, kind of comparing them like for like. And as I say, that's also online. So there's no need to take really extensive notes. Everything's there if you want to consult it. So what I'm going to do, there isn't really time to go into any great detail about each of these studies, but I thought some headline findings might be useful for us. And just to be clear, when I'm talking about arts engagement in this context, I'm not referring to arts therapy or to art in hospitals, both of which have very well-established traditions. But I'm talking about encounters with the arts and culture at galleries, museums, cinemas, theatres, or indeed fun palaces, or engaged with directly through painting, drawing, and artwork that we make ourselves, all of which happens outside of the clinical environment. So I'm not looking at the way that arts and health come together within that clinical environment, but encounters that we're all familiar with, like here. So what happens when we start to look at the relationship between the arts and health? Well, the first thing that becomes obvious when considering this kind of research, as you've probably guessed already because I mentioned the Nordic countries, is that the majority of the work has actually been conducted in the Nordic region. This is partly because there's already a great supply of population-based surveys, and they've consistently included questions about socio-cultural participation, and they can be linked to other registers, those dealing with disease and death. People seem to be a lot less squeamish about privacy when it comes to their health data, and they're quite happy for these two registers to be cross-referenced. So beyond this, most surveys of this kind start here with a seminal study that was published in the British Medical Journal in 1996. And a Swedish team found that after adjusting for age, gender, educational level, income, long-term disease, social networks, smoking, and exercise, people attending cultural events only occasionally were more at risk of dying than those who attended regularly, with those attending the least found to have a 60% higher risk of death than those attending the most. Now, I mentioned that analyses of previous research in this area go back typically to this 1996 study, but it's actually possible to go back further than this And the first study included in the evidence base comes from 1992, with findings by the same team, again a Swedish team, reported as early as 1985. So this work's been going on for quite some time. If we stick with the British Medical Journal team for now, 4 years after their original article was published, the same team attempted to introduce some art form differentiation into their calculations. So before it was just cultural attendance en masse. Now they're actually trying to break it down and see which forms of art actually have a positive impact. And they started to look at the relationship between survival and seven different forms of cultural attendance. And they found a positive association for cinemas, concerts, art exhibitions and museums, but not for attendance at theatrical, religious or sporting events. Make of that what you will. And for those of you who work in theatre, don't despair. Theatre makes a comeback in a little while. So the following year, the same team explored the relationship between cultural attendance and self-rated health, which Nick just mentioned, which is how healthy people report feeling. And they found that participants who were surveyed in the 1980s and 1990s, whose cultural attendance was low at both of the dates, or had decreased between the two dates, reported lower perceived health, and those whose attendance was high at the two dates or had increased between the two reported higher self-rated health. So this suggested a relationship between the amount of culture that we access and our general feeling of health. And taking account of the fact that the people whose cultural attendance decreased over time had poor perceived health, and that those who increased over time had better perceived health, the researchers concluded that any positive effects of cultural stimulation were actually transient, and they needed to be replenished and topped up over time. Otherwise, the good effect wore off. So in 2004, a team overlapping with the original British Medical Journal one established that an association could be discerned between low social participation and increased incidence of coronary heart disease and death. In reducing this tendency, attendance at the cinema, theatre, there you go, is making a comeback, concerts, art exhibitions and museums had by far in most cases the most significant impact. A couple of years later, a Finnish team looked at the relationship between leisure participation and survival and found that 25 years after a survey had originally been conducted, only 68.5% of the subjects with scarce leisure participation were still alive, compared to 84.6% of the subjects with intermediate and abundant participation. So again, it suggests that there's a positive relationship between regular cultural participation and life expectancy. I'm going through this very fast, but the evidence is all in the articles. This is just the kind of top-line summary of what was found. In 2009, the BMJ team explored the relationship between cultural attendance and cancer-related mortality. They found that in urban areas, rare attendees at cultural events had higher cancer-related mortality than frequent attenders. So from this research, we can conclude that cultural attendance might have some kind of cancer preventative effect. Moving to Norway, and between 1995 and 97, over 8,000 adolescents completed a comprehensive questionnaire about their lifestyle, health, and quality of life, and they underwent a clinical examination during which various measurements were taken. Between 2006 and 2008, 1,400 of these participants were followed up as young adults. An account was taken of their body mass index, waist circumference, hip-to-waist ratio, and bodily development as an indicator of obesity. Somebody mentioned obesity as a growing health issue. I think that was you this morning. And so this is really what this study was looking at. And whereas participation in social activity was found to have a positive relationship to obesity. In medical jargon, a positive association doesn't necessarily mean that it's not a value judgment, it's not a positive thing, it just means that you're more likely, it's a sort of directly proportional relationship. Whereas participation in cultural activity caused a negative relationship, especially in girls. And the effect of this was found to be more pronounced in girls who were at the recommended weight when the original survey was conducted. In other words, cultural participation is useful in maintaining your weight over time. Okay, so moving from physical to mental health, and a team examined data from around 1,800 Swedish participants over 75, who were first surveyed about their socio-cultural activities in the late 1980s and followed up twice in the early and mid-1990s. Now, comparing those participants who developed dementia between the two follow-up dates with those who didn't, the researchers found that social activities, including attendance at art events, and mental activities, including painting and drawing and any kind of active participation in the making of art, helped to stave off dementia in later life. So that's really a kind of whistle-stop tour through some of the headlines of the evidence base. And before thinking about what these studies mean for those of us working at the intersection between the arts and health, I'd like to turn quickly to the mechanisms that are speculated on when a positive association is observed between arts participation and health. If you're like me and you're curious, you won't want to know whether there's a relationship, but if there is, then why there is. And so one of the theories that's put forward, and we've already heard this mentioned today, is that of social capital. So several of the studies, including the earliest one that I mentioned, and the majority of the Finnish ones, are grounded in social capital theory. And what this does is it suggests that the artistic specificities of engagement are subordinate to the social milieu in which that kind of activity takes place. So in other words, it's not the fact that you've come to the Delaware Pavilion this afternoon that's important and seen an exhibition. It's the fact that you've been amongst other people and you've had a social experience. And the BMJ team, who I've been consistently referring to, at first, when they started to look at this, they also acknowledged that perhaps cultural behavior is so intermingled with life as a whole that it's impossible to discern its influence. But 4 years later, the same team found that social ties had a negligible effect upon life expectancy. So the jury is still out on the social capital theory when it comes to the empirical evidence. Several of the analyses in the evidence base touch upon the cognitive function of cultural engagement. And this is underwritten by the idea that stimulation of the brain has a positive effect. So environmental enrichment in rats has been found to improve learning and memory and promote exploration. And by the same token, several human studies have demonstrated the positive impact of arts engagement, particularly music, on recovery from brain damage and depression, which takes us into therapeutic territory. But if we maintain a focus on prevention rather than cure, we find a connection between the brain and the body via the so-called HPA axis, which is made up of the hypothalamus, the pituitary, and the adrenal glands. And a relationship has been discovered between the HPA axis and stress. And consideration has also been given particularly within the field of occupational health, to the psychosocial factors, including engagement in the arts, which might diminish work-related stress and improve health. So, for example, there's a short-term study of Canadian emergency service workers which found that attending concerts, ballet, theatres and museums significantly predicted greater physical health. You can imagine these Canadian emergency services workers working under very stressful conditions, but if they engaged in these art forms, it was found that their physical health improved. So this acknowledged relationship between the brain and the body prompts us to enter the complicated-sounding territory of psychoneuroimmunology. What this involves is the consideration of the interrelated endocrine, immune, and nervous systems. The HPA axis that I just mentioned is part of the endocrine system, which is connected to cells regulating immunity, which again is mediated by stress. We all know that if we're under stress and we're deprived of sleep, then we're more susceptible to disease. And finally, to neurotransmitters, which affect mood, cognition, and emotion in a kind of feedback loop. A 1999 study of the impact of psychosocial and behavioral factors on cancer found that depression negatively influenced mechanisms central to carcinogenesis, including the ability of cells to repair damaged DNA. So that suggests that if people who were depressed and had cancer had less ability to fight the effects of carcinogenesis. And the significance of studies of this kind is that in making the connection between, for example, stress, depression, and chronic disease, they pave the way for an exploration of mechanisms and potential catalysts, including arts engagement, that might reduce the negative side of this equation. So, in other words, arts engagement, it's thought, might have a palliative effect in terms of reducing stress, which in turn might make us more resilient when it comes to disease. And the last of the mechanisms, the main mechanisms that's speculated on when a positive association is observed between arts engagement and health, and this is my personal favorite, is that of epigenetics. Now, recent research has shown that our environment has an effect on which genes in our body are switched on and off at any given time. And it's thought that the signals controlling this process are carried not within the coding part of the genome, but within the surrounding material or epigenome. And one of the ways in which this process might work is through the methylation of cytosine, which is one of the 4 nucleotides making up the DNA code. And that's been observed when the body is placed under stress. So this methylation of cytosine happens under stress. And what happens is that when these base pairs are methylated, it impedes the translation of proteins from the DNA molecule. So it kind of compromises the enzymes or whatever proteins are being made by the body. Epigenetic markers like these have been found in a range of different conditions, from prostate and breast cancers to ADHD. And it's thought that short-term exposure to a range of external factors can cause long-term susceptibility or resistance to disease. An important recent finding in the field of epigenetics is that susceptibility and resistance can both be communicated through the generations. So, for example, epigenetic markers can play a part in manifesting alcoholism in one generation and its transmission through to the next generation. And similar epigenetic mechanisms stimulated by adverse environmental conditions are also implicated in the intergenerational transmission of depression, schizophrenia, and bipolar disorder through the methylation of DNA in the frontal cortex of the brain. So you can see it's a pretty powerful theory about how our bodily mechanisms might be compromised through the switching on or off of certain genes. And that's under adverse environmental conditions, but the opposite of this is also true. And if we think of cultural stimulation as a form of environmental enrichment, this has obvious significance. So one of the Swedish researchers involved in the BMJ team argues that while cultural engagement has been shown to have a positive intra-generational effect, it may also prove to contribute to mitigating the epigenetic transfer of stressors through the generations. So that's pretty powerful, that cultural enrichment or environmental enrichment through cultural stimulation can switch on or switch off certain genes within our body that make us less prone to disease in the long term, as a theory for explaining these kinds of observations. So where does this leave us then when we consider the relationship between arts and engagement and health? In general, the 15 longitudinal studies making up the evidence base hint at a positive association between arts engagement in the arts, longer life expectancy, and resistance from a range of diseases. But, and there's always a but, none of the researchers involved in these studies are prepared to state that there's a definite causal relationship between the two. In fact, many of them suggest that there might be a residual confounder, a kind of lurking factor which mediates the relationship between arts engagement and health. And in this regard, I'd urge you to think about inequality, which Nick mentioned in his presentation, which is endemic in our socioeconomic system at the moment. And we all know that poverty and inequality have an inversely proportional relationship. This is a World Health Organization study of poverty and inequality and life expectancy in Glasgow. You can see that Glasgow is at the top and the bottom of this table. People living in the most impoverished parts of Glasgow can only expect to live to the age of 54, whereas those in the more privileged parts live to the age of 82. So you can see the kind of effect that area deprivation has upon people's life expectancy, which obviously relates to what we're talking about here. So we know that there's an inversely proportional relationship between area deprivation and cultural participation, meaning that engagement in the arts tends to increase as area deprivation decreases. So it seems reasonable to suggest that access to material resources leads to longer, healthier lives, with arts engagement possibly serving as an indicator to access of resources and a healthier lifestyle. This is important because it may not be the kind of magic bullet relationship between arts engagement and health. It may be the fact that because you access the arts, that's an indicator that you're accessing a healthier lifestyle. So in short, we don't have a hard and fast formula linking arts engagement and health, but we do have a very good sample of research upon which we can build. And if anybody's interested, there are a number of UK data sets that are ripe for analysis, and consideration is given to each of these in the published report for this project. So in conclusion, I think it's important to note a factor that was particularly impressive to me when I was reading through these studies is that the quality of arts engagement is taken to be paramount in manifesting health effects. And when I talk about quality, I'm not making a value judgment, I'm talking about quality as opposed to quantity. What are the kind of real subjective characteristics or properties of engaging with the arts? And what this focus on quality from many of the researchers serves to focus our attention away from the quantitative measurements of cultural value, which are in favour at the moment, in favour of a better understanding of the particular experience of engaging with art, film, music and theatre, all of which we've seen have been proven to be beneficial through these studies. And it's of great value to us, if I can use that word, that the Cultural Value Project, of which my research was a part, is going to be reporting relatively soon, and will hopefully refocus our attention onto the cultural experience per se, making any instrumental benefits or second-order benefits or holistic benefits secondary to the cultural experience. So, the potentially positive effects of engaging with certain forms of culture provide arguments for the continued funding of arts activities, in my mind. Those arts activities in and of themselves could potentially be valuable to us as a society. And the fact that the research in the evidence base has been carried out at a large scale across whole populations within the Nordic countries could potentially exempt arts organisations from having to continually justify their value to the public purse. If we can make the bigger argument that the arts have some kind of role to play in longer lives, better lived, then we've got some sort of an argument. So what this means is that evangelists like myself, working at the intersection between the arts and health, can go forward armed with slightly more evidence than the theologians, evidence that has been considered sufficient for Nordic governments to implement arts programs at a national level aimed at improving population health. Many thanks.